I opened a city archive box marked Subgrade Works Closed. Inside was a street plan that every local historian claims is complete, but the plan showed a full level of corridors under the oldest block downtown, arched, measured, labeled, connected, like a second city under the first. The problem is simple. That level is not supposed to exist. It isn't on the modern maps. It isn't in the building permits. It isn't in the tour brochures. And the folder had a rubber stamp, dated decades later than the papers inside, as if someone reclassified it after the fact. Now look at me for a second. If this is just a basement, why did the paperwork treat it like a quarantine zone? Before we say Tartaria or reset or any of the big words people throw around online, I want to do this the hard way. One document at a time, one anomaly at a time, then we see what's left. The first clue wasn't dramatic. It was a line item. Fill, inert, compacted, seal, masonry, vent, restricted. Not renovate, not demolish, seal, restricted. The second clue was the index card system. Archivists love order. Cities love bureaucracy. If you want to hide something, you don't burn it. You bury it in clerical noise. This box had a card catalog sheet that listed the folder title, the street name, and the date range. But someone had torn the top corner off the card. Why does that matter? Because the top corner is where the original accession number sits, the number that tells you where it came from, who submitted it, and when. No corner, no chain of custody, and beneath the torn edge, in a different ink, the word reassigned. Reassigned to what? To whom? And why now? Here's where it gets worse. The folder had 3 separate references to the same subgrade level, but each one used a different euphemism. In one memo, it was utility drift. In another, service gallery. In the third, void. Utility drift sounds harmless. Service gallery sounds like a museum. Void sounds like a problem. Same place. 3 names. 3 moods. So I did what you would do if you were trying to prove you aren't chasing ghosts. I looked for the boring stuff. Water, sewers, heating, cables. Because if there's really an extra level, it has to intersect with infrastructure. Pipes don't care about mythology. The city kept a bound ledger of maintenance calls for a century. The pages were thin. The handwriting changed every few years. It was the kind of record that only exists because no one expects it to be interesting, until you hit the entries that don't match the world above. Odor complaint, lower gallery, sealed. Subsidence, void under East Lane, tamped. Gas accumulation, restricted vent, monitor. Hold that thought, because on the next page, there was a hand-drawn cross-section of a street you can drive down today. The sidewalk, the storefronts, the curb. And beneath it, a row of windows, real windows, at what the engineer called the former ground line. Former. So either the ground used to be lower and then it rose, or the buildings used to be taller and then they sank, or someone is lying on paper. Now the easy answer is, cities change grades. Streets get raised. Sidewalks get rebuilt. It happens. But here's what doesn't happen. A whole run of buildings from the same decade on the same block, all ending up with the same kind of half-buried windows, all with the same arch shape, all with the same brick pattern, all with the same odd choice of stone lintels, then all getting labeled in a municipal folder like a hazard, and then, like a heartbeat, the same phrase returns. Do not open without authorization. Authorization from who? This is where online communities jump straight to suppressed tech. Hidden power systems, secret tunnels, a buried civilization. And I get it. When you see arches and brickwork underground, your brain reaches for a story. But the most unsettling possibility is simpler. What if the city wasn't hiding a treasure? What if it was hiding a mistake? Let's talk about those arches. Modern basements are practical. Concrete walls, straight lines, efficiency. Old subgrade spaces, when they're built to last, look different. You see brick vaults. You see thick piers. You see ceramic insulators embedded in the masonry, like someone planned for wiring long before wiring was normal. Why? Because in the late 1800s and early 1900s, cities were experiments. Steam, gas, early electric, pneumatic tubes for documents, district heating in some places, telegraph and telephone lines multiplying like vines. They built service corridors because they had to, not because they were hiding. So when you find a second city under a street, the first question isn't who built it, it's what was it for? And the second question is more dangerous. What happened that made them seal it? There's a pattern you can see across multiple cities, even without believing in a global reset. Big fire, big flood, epidemic, industrial accident, regrading projects that raise streets and bury old entrances, construction booms that create layers. All of that is normal. But the archive language in this box wasn't normal. It didn't read like, after the fire, we rebuilt. It read like, after the incident, we contained. Contained what? That's why they never reopened it. I found a meeting transcript, typed on thin paper, with coffee stains at the edges, the kind of document that was never meant to be glamorous. A committee, public works, health department, fire marshal, 3 departments that only sit together when something crosses domains. The transcript didn't say collapse. It said conditions. Persistent damp. Unknown venting. Residual effluent. Unstable fill. And one line that was underlined twice. Risk of re-aerosolization. That is not the language of architecture. That is the language of contamination. Stop. Think about what that implies. If they were worried about something becoming airborne again, then sealing wasn't about hiding history. It was about preventing recurrence. Now you might be thinking, okay, maybe it was sewage. Maybe it was mold. Maybe it was gas. Sure. But then why the reclassification? Why the torn catalog card? Why the euphemisms? Why authorization? Because safety protocols have an ugly side. They create secrets without villains. They tell people not to talk, not because there's a conspiracy, but because panic spreads faster than facts. And if a city once survived a crisis that most of us have forgotten, the paperwork would look exactly like this: careful, vague, overlapping, and obsessed with control. But I still needed something physical, something that wasn't just words. Back in the archive, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The microfilm reel for that same block had a splice, a clean cut, then a jump, as if a few frames had been removed and the rest glued back together. The librarian called it damage. Maybe it was, but the missing section lined up exactly with the months the permits went silent. And when I asked for the paper originals, the folder arrived with a hole punch through the corner, right where the routing stamps would have been. Not shredded, not destroyed, just conveniently unreadable, because the deeper you go, the more you realize. The official city narrative is flat. One timeline, one grade line, one clean story. The ground is not flat. The ground is layered, and layers mean episodes. Here's an episode most people ignore. When a city raises a street, it doesn't always gut the buildings. Sometimes it just keeps building upward. New sidewalk, new curb, new ground floor. The old ground floor becomes a basement. That's documented. But there's a difference between we raised the street and we sealed the galleries. One is engineering. The other is containment. So I looked for the missing year. Every archive has one. A gap, a silence. A period where the records thin out, then resume as if nothing happened. In this box, the gap wasn't a whole decade. It was just a slice, 11 months. Permits before, permits after. But in the middle, only a few odd slips, like someone tore a chapter out of a book. The slips were stamped expedited. Expedited is what you do when you don't want debate. And one of them referenced a material that wasn't typical for simple backfill. Cinder-based aggregate. Cinders insulate. They drain. They're cheap when you have coal. They also absorb and trap. Trap what? Now look at me for a second. If you were trying to neutralize an underground space that had moisture, odor, gas, and unknown venting, what would you do? You would fill it with something porous and inert, something that reduces standing water and limits vapor movement, then cap it with masonry. That's not a fantasy. That's a protocol. And protocols can look like cover-ups from the outside. Let me step in here. If you've ever walked through an old downtown and noticed doors that go down instead of up, or little iron railings that look like they're protecting nothing, that's not a cute architectural quirk. That's a memory. It's a clue that the city used to be at a different height. And in the archive, they know it. So I went to the buildings. Not with a crowbar, not with an urban explorer's flashlight. With permission, where I could get it, and with open eyes, where I couldn't. Old downtown storefronts have a tell. Look at the bricks near the sidewalk. Look for a horizontal scar, a change in mortar, a line where the color shifts. That's where the world moved. In one building, the basement door opened to a stairwell that went down 5 steps and stopped at a wall. Fresh brick, too fresh for the building's age, a patch job. But above the patch, the arch continued. An arch has no reason to exist if it doesn't open into something. So, what did it open into before? Across the street, a utility access panel on the sidewalk had a cast mark, a manufacturer name, and a date that didn't match the storefront renovation era. Not proof of anything by itself, just another small mismatch. And mismatches are the currency of this story. At this point, it would be easy to say, see, reset, mud flood, buried infrastructure. But that's a leap. So I tightened the chain. I pulled old photos. Not the dramatic ruins shots people love. The boring ones. Parades, streetcars, storefronts, family poses that accidentally capture the street behind them. In several images, the same storefront appears with different proportions. The sign sits higher in one. The window tops are closer to the street in another. You can fake a story. You can't easily fake the geometry of a street over time. And that geometry whispered the same thing the archive did. The ground line changed, but the archive wasn't just describing regrading. It was treating the spaces below as if they were hazardous even after the regrade. That's the pivot. That's the part that makes hidden history feel plausible. Because normal projects get celebrated. They get plaques. They get before and after displays. Containment projects get labels like closed. They get torn catalog corners. They get 3 different names so no one can search them easily. And they get people like me standing in a public reading room holding a folder that wasn't supposed to be obvious. Here's the question that kept drilling into my head. If this was only about raising streets, why does the paperwork keep talking about vents? Vents are about what moves: air, gas, spores, smoke. Something that doesn't stay put. I trace those vents the only way you can, when the map stops being helpful. You look for what got bricked up. On one alley wall behind the block, there were 3 rectangles of newer brickwork, stacked like someone had patched windows. But the mortar didn't match the surrounding wall. It was cleaner, different sand, different era. Above the patches, you could still see the soot stain rising in a faint column, as if air had been moving there for years before it got stopped. Inside one building, a maintenance closet had a metal grate in the floor that led to nothing but darkness. The supervisor told me it was an old return. Return to what? He didn't know. No one working there knew. The grate was painted over so many times, the screw heads were soft. And that's the weird part about buried infrastructure. It doesn't announce itself with secrets. It announces itself with people shrugging. I found a code book from the health department, just a thin pamphlet, not classified, not dramatic. It listed standardized phrases inspectors used, so reports stayed consistent. Most entries were plain: rodent activity, standing water, structural crack. But one code line felt out of place. Atmospheric anomaly. Not odor, not gas, not mold. Atmospheric anomaly. That phrase shows up twice in the subgrade folder. Twice, then never again. Why invent a phrase like that unless you ran into something you couldn't describe without alarming people? Now look at me for a second. This is where a lot of stories go off the rails, because our brains hate a blank space. We rush to fill it with monsters, or empires, or villains. But if you've ever worked around old systems, you know the truth can be boring and terrifying at the same time. A sewer line that was never properly vented can push hydrogen sulfide into a corridor. Coal gas leaks can linger in pockets under streets. Industrial solvents can soak into brick and release vapors for years. And once you have a connected network of voids, one problem doesn't stay in one place. It migrates. It finds cracks. It finds basements. That makes authorization make sense. Not because there's treasure down there, because there's liability. And because the people who inherit a city also inherit every buried decision the last generation made. So I looked for the legal layer, the part no one on YouTube talks about: insurance. When insurance companies map a city, they care about risk: firewalls, construction type, fuel storage, open shafts, boiler rooms. Those maps are brutally honest, because money demands honesty. In the archive's oversized drawer, I found sheets that labeled parts of the block as sub, not basement, sub. And in the margin, in a tiny hand, a note: access sealed. Why would an insurer care that access is sealed? Because sealed access changes how a fire behaves. Because sealed shafts change how smoke travels. Because sealed corridors can trap pressure. And because if first responders can't reach a space, it becomes a blind spot. Then I found the repair order that finally made the whole thing click. It wasn't about history. It was about a drill, a fire department training report. The report described a planned exercise in an unused service passage. It said they entered, tested air, and withdrew. It didn't say why, but someone had written in the margin, in pencil: symptoms, no details, just that, symptoms. If that's true, then sealing wasn't aesthetic, it was medical. And suddenly, the buried windows, the euphemisms, the reassignments, the torn catalog corner, they stop looking like a movie plot. They start looking like an incident response that never got fully declassified. Because cities don't declassify embarrassment. They just pave over it. Do we spend years excavating and cleaning an entire hidden layer under downtown? Or do we fill it, seal it, and move the city above it? If you choose the second option, You don't call it, "We buried part of the city." You call it subgrade remediation. You create an authorization requirement. You use euphemisms. You reassign the file so it doesn't come up in casual searches. Not because you're evil. Because if the public hears there's a sealed underground level full of unknown conditions, the city doesn't get questions. It gets panic. Now look at me again. That's the twist that makes the archive box feel cold. It suggests the cover-up might be a safety protocol, a containment decision. And if that's true, then the story isn't "they stole our history." It's "they sealed a problem and the city forgot why." And forgetting is powerful, because when you forget the reason for a protocol, it starts to look like malice. And then the myths rush in. Tartaria, reset, buried worlds, suppressed tech. Those myths aren't born from nothing. They're born from a paper trail that stops explaining itself. So where does that leave us? You end up with the same questions beating in your head. Why were the catalog corners torn? Why did the name change 3 times? Why is there a missing 11 months? Why do the vent warnings repeat? Why note a pressure differential? And why did no one ever write, in plain language, the sentence we all want? This is what happened. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe the cause wasn't a single event. Maybe it was a slow accumulation. Coal smoke, damp, sewage leaks, gas seepage, until the galleries became a liability. Or maybe it was a sharp episode that the city decided to quietly contain. Either way, the pattern is the same. There is a buried layer of infrastructure under the official city story. It is documented, but poorly. It is named, but inconsistently. It is sealed, but still present. And that creates a strange moral problem for anyone digging into hidden history. Because the more you insist it must be villains, the less you see the possibility that it was caretakers. People making ugly decisions to reduce risk. People who believed the safest story was the simplest one. If you want more deep dives like this, where we follow the paperwork instead of the hype, subscribe and tell me what city you want next. Just one, and we'll pull it apart. One last thing. In the back of the folder, there was a single-page inspection form with checkboxes. Most were empty. One was marked. Pressure differential noted. That means the sealed space was breathing. Not like a creature, like a system. If you have a buried corridor connected to old utility lines, connected to drains, connected to a network of other voids, it can develop pressure shifts. Warm air rising in one shaft, cold air sinking in another. Barometric changes. It can pull air through cracks. It can drag odor up into basements. And if at some point those corridors were exposed to contamination, industrial, biological, chemical, then they become a long-term risk. Now let me be honest. This is where people split into camps. Camp A says, this proves an entire suppressed civilization, with advanced technology intentionally erased. Camp B says, this is just urban development. Stories stacked on stories. Nothing more. Both camps miss the third option. A city can erase evidence without erasing truth. Not to hide a glorious past, to keep people alive. Imagine the moment. A crisis hits. Maybe an outbreak. Maybe a gas event. Maybe a fire that drives smoke down into service galleries. Maybe floodwater that turns corridors into a soup of sewage and chemicals. Officials walk those galleries. They smell it. They see the damp. They see the deposits on the brick. And then they have to make a choice. Now, if you're still with me, here's the final needle. On the archive box lid, in pencil, almost erased, someone wrote 2 words. Not a street name, not a date. 2 words. Do not disturb. That isn't a historian's note. That is a warning passed between departments. And warnings like that don't survive decades unless the thing they refer to never fully went away. So the next time you see a basement window half buried at street level, don't ask, "Was there a lost empire?" Ask the question the paperwork keeps begging you to ask. What happened down there that made them seal it? And then make sure we forgot why. If you want the next chapter, subscribe now. Leave your best clue below. What felt off? I'll see you in the next file. Until then, stay alert right now.